1947 to the present. The placement of Vishnu's sculpture in the midst of secular architectural setting of a modern science institution poses many intriguing questions. How does a sacred image come to be treated as a modern sculpture and yet retain some of its historical and ritual charge? Dr. Garimella's presentation questions how this lustrous sculpture relates to the many contemporary art purchases that Homi Bhabha was making from artists in Mumbai and other artists. It examines this relationship between classical and monumental, its evolution since independence, and its relations to sculptural practice internationally. A Bangalore-based designer and art historian, Dr. Annapurna Garimella focuses on the art and architecture of India. She is the managing director at Jackfruit Research and Design Pvt, a research and design organization. She is also the managing trustee of Art, Resources and Teaching Trust, a not-for-profit organization that gathers resources and promotes research and teaching in art and architectural history, archaeology, crafts, design and other related disciplines. She is currently on the board of the Essex School of Art and Communication, University of Hyderabad. We welcome Dr. Annapurna Garimella, and if you have any questions, we'll take them after me.
Okay, let me just get this opened up. Okay. Good evening. Thank you all so much for coming on a Saturday evening in busy Mumbai or Bombay. I thank Bhavda Lad. This is the third year I've been here. And again, I've had a great batch of students in the program, totally interested and alert and ready to become critical rasics, I think is the word. So I'm very happy about that, and I'm also really happy to talk about this because it began with an object that's in your city. And can you hear me? Is this okay? Yeah? Is this better? Yeah. The thinking in part began with work I did in this city. I did 2 MA theses, weirdly, but one of them was on Corbusier and Chandigarh, and really looking at how Corbusier and Nehru and Mulk Raj Anand were negotiating the creation of a capital that had to be both modern, India's modernism, visualized in urban and architectural terms, but also a new kind of sociology. For Corbusier, it was the first time that he got to build a city for all of his thinking about urbanism, a complete city, design a complete city that was oriented towards the automobile. And for Mulk Raj Anand and for Marg, it was an opportunity to showcase this notion that India's modernism could encompass the vernacular space in which Chandigarh was located. Why is it called Chandigarh? Because there was a Chandi temple there. That's why it's called Chandigarh. Chandi, the fortress of Chandi, goddess Chandi. So it's a very interesting set of things that came together. And of course, when you work at Marg, I did the book for Mulk Raj Anand's 100th birthday, and it was called Shaping the Indian Modern, and I went through all of his archives while he was alive. Unfortunately, he died before the book, he actually saw the book. But that was another experience which was really intense because his archive spans from his early years as a student in India to being a student at University of London to being, in his own mind, part of the Bloomsbury group, the Spanish Civil War, being a broadcaster, doing broadcasting at BBC, a marriage in the UK, coming back to India, falling in love with Anil de Silva, who was this very interesting woman who was involved with IPTA, and being a very interesting socialist, humanist kind of figure in the city, and also, of course, then being encouraged by J.R.D. Tata and particularly Jawaharlal Nehru to start, to extend the journey that Nehru started in his book, in his letters to Indira Gandhi, which was the discovery of India. Which he, how does a person who's grown up in Harrow and Eton really come to terms with this India? If you ever want like something deeply moving, you must read Nehru's Last Will and Testament, where he talks about his relationship to the Ganga. It's the one time that he really allows himself to speak about India in a very emotional way that connects to some sort of non-independent struggle thing. I mean, it's one of the few times that he's doing this. So all these experiences, I think, sort of prepared me to, or maybe positioned me or incited me to kind of think about these questions about the classical and the monumental. I am a classically trained art historian. My PhD thesis was on 14th and 15th century urban planning and temple building in the largest urban archaeological site in the world, I think, Hampi. But I'm also have a background in modernism because of my work on Corbusier, and also I'm trained as a designer, so I do that kind of work. So it's very interesting to me to come to India as a newly minted PhD and discover that there's this upswell in the contemporary art world here, and it has no space for all this stuff that I'm thinking about. It wants to just, there's amnesia, there's a kind of very narcissistic relationship to the past, like this was my teacher, or this was, do you understand what I'm trying to say? But not that kind of detached encompassment of a history that's much larger than your own connection to it, your own immediate autobiographical connection to it. I was very curious about this amnesia, and I really wanted to kind of engage with certain questions. Simultaneously, TIFR, Tata Institute for Fundamental Research, in the Navy area in the city, in your city, decided to start archiving itself, because after liberalization and after 2000, a lot of important people have become 100 or 150. So there's been the Binod Bihari Mukherjee exhibitions and the Rabindranath Tagore exhibitions and all these kinds of things. There's also 100 years of Homi Bhabha, the physicist, not the literary theorist, who's not 100 yet. So I went, I was there at TIFR, and I was roped in as a kind of like a consultant to the archivist there. Some of people in the audience, like Gaiwan Mehta, were also there in that moment. And there's Mortimer Chatterjee here, who's done a fabulous book on the collection at the TIFR. And I was very curious about this collection, this relationship to Marg. I had just finished my book on Mulk Raj Anand, and I was very curious about the way that, the kind of sculpture that was in the museum, and also the way it was displayed. So this work comes in part out of that experience. The other experience, of course, is I'm deeply interested in any case, the way that the classical is received. Let me put it to you very straightforwardly. There is no such thing as a classical or a monumental in pre-modern world. These are modernist categories, right? There is no notion of a monumental. You may, in the kind of discrete category, you may have Bhrigu or Brihat, like the Brihat Samhita, the really big samhita, right? Or something like that, like something big. But that doesn't necessarily translate into monumental. There may be commemorative. For example, like the Tanjavur Rajarajeshwara temple, the Brihadishwara temple, right? But it doesn't have the same notion of the monumental that emerges out of a modernist consciousness, which sees a public space for the notion of a public itself is a modern concept. It's a post-Enlightenment and post-American Revolution and French Revolution and Industrial Revolution. All these revolutions created our current notion of public as it exists today. And the notion of a monumental is emerging out of, by and large, a public, secular notion of big art, right? That's something that can stand pretty strongly. It can be twisted and turned a little bit here and there to address something else, but I think I'm pretty comfortable saying that. The notion of a classical, in the way that modernists treat classical, is also a very modern concept. You cannot easily translate Margi and Deshi into classical and folk. It's kind of fake sort of taxonomy, translation of taxonomies. It's certainly not the same way that Komal Kothari, for example, in his An Oral History of Rajasthan, talks about the way that folk artists learn music and the way that Guru Sishya Sampradaya artists learn music. Those are different ways of thinking about folk and classical. What I'm talking about classical is that which is pre-modern, or that which is looked at as being something at a very high status, high taste, from a position of a contemporary, right? So let me put those two things out there. So for example, for Corbusier, his own notion of the automobile was contemporary, but he was very interested in the classical cities of the old world, like Algiers or India, or places in India. It helped him think about, or for example, Athens. He sketched them, he drew them, he looked at them. And it was, in some ways, his modernism, his contemporary, he felt had to relate to some sort of notions that he saw being enacted there. But they weren't the same things. So this notion of classical and the monumental are deeply modern ideas. So beginning with that, I will sort of read my paper, and then I will, let me just begin with this image. Those of you who are not familiar with the Pandyan dynasty, they were ruling out of Madurai, a very old Tamil dynasty. This dates from about the 12th century, this sculpture. Okay. Sometime between 1950 and 1956, we don't know. The atomic scientist Homi Bhabha received a gift of a four-armed granite Pandyan Vishnu sculpture seated in Lalitasana. Lalitasana is the pose of royal ease with one leg hanging off the simhasana, the seat. Lalitasana, or the position of royal ease. It came from a temple setting and was clearly designed for worship. When it entered Bhabha's collection, he had it installed in the newly founded Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in Mumbai sometime before 1958. The Vishnu was placed in the open at the end of the porch behind the Bhabha Auditorium and faces the lawn behind the cafeteria of the research wing of the Institute. The sculpture is on a pedestal so as to make viewing in the round possible. Something for which it was not originally designed. So when you look at the back side, you'll see that it's not as articulated as the front side. It was meant to be seen and used from the front. The back was done just so that it's not incomplete and therefore not worshipable, right? Yet there's something of the performative Ritual is a kind of performance. It was designed, even in the beginning, to receive as a kind of performance, worship, right? Yet there is something of the performative that continues and evolves in the sculpture's siting. The large open space in front of it and the limited space at the back suggest that the image could sit as a backdrop, and the deity could even be seen as a benevolent, maybe even an auspicious presence to an event happening in front of it. Vishnu is particularly resonant in an institution focused on atomic energy research, given that he's seen as filled with brilliance, tejas, and associated with maintaining cosmic order. The placement of Vishnu in a modern science institution situated in a secular architectural setting by a man regarded by many as a polymath, as a connoisseur, and as the founder of India's atomic energy program poses many intriguing questions. How does a sacred image come to be treated as a modern sculpture while retaining some of its historical and ritual charge? In what way does this work of art relate to the many contemporary art purchases that Bhabha was making from artists in Bombay and other Indian cities? How did contemporary sculptors who sought such client patrons address their various desires for modernity, classicism, cosmopolitanism, and Indian-ness when they composed their work? Has this relationship to the classical and the monumental continued and evolved over the last 6 decades since India has become independent? More broadly, how might we think about the practice of modern sculpture in independent India and what relation it had to the practice of sculpture internationally? Let me just, before I go on to read anymore, let me just show you a few other places. This is, of course, Homi Bhabha in his office. It's taken from Mortimer's and his Tara's book. And this is Bhabha in his office at TIFR, I think. And this is a sculpture that he has there. So you can see this is also displayed to be seen in the round, much like the Vishnu. This is a very wonderful image that somebody gave the editor of my book in which this essay is going to be published in, and she passed it on. This is Nehru visiting the Faculty of Fine Arts at MSU in Baroda with Chancellor Fateh Singh Gaikwad and the Dean, and here are all the artists. So it's a different moment where you cannot imagine a Prime Minister going to a student art show at a university today. But at that time, Nehru did. And then this is, of course, the Shiva Nataraja that the Indian government gave the Physics Research Institute in Geneva, CERN. And it was installed by Fritz Capra, the physicist who wrote the Tao of Physics. And it basically is an important engagement for a physicist with what he sees as Hindu ideas of matter and cosmology. I have a pet theory that when physicists come to the end of their careers as doing modern physics, they become physicists, they become cosmologists. And that's almost like to a pattern that's set. This is another instance. This is, of course, another physicist, Abdul Kalam, standing in front of a Shiva Nataraja at the Madras Museum in the Bronze Gallery. Shiva Nataraja is no longer in Chola Mandalam, which is what that whole halo around him is actually probably a visualization of the kingdom of the Cholas. This image was crystallized in the Chola period by royal Chola patrons. That aureole around him, the halo, is sort of thought to be as the Chola Mandalam, or the kingdom of the Cholas, as the cosmos. And Shiva Nataraja is at its center. But very interestingly, Dr. Nagaswamy, who curated this exhibition, took that. It wasn't enough that he was in the version of the Chola cosmos that the Cholas imagined, but he actually places it in a Copernican universe. Because you see, what's behind is a modern astronomical image of the skies, right? So this is a very interesting And you can see in the back where it's exactly situated. So Dr. Nagaswamy, of course, has a son in the US who lives in California and has learned how to use PowerPoint, and though he's quite senior, and he feels very committed to marrying his intense Shaivite Siddhanta practice and belief to modern technology and modern science. So this is in part that kind of thing that you see right here. Okay. A 1956 cartoon from Shankar's Weekly, which was Shankar was a cartoonist who was in Delhi, and Nehru told him, please also lampoon me. 1956 cartoon from Shankar's Weekly, published in New Delhi, provides us further insights into period perceptions of modern sculpture and its patrons. In the visual, Nehru stands in front of a modern sculpture of a male figure, wiry in body and macho in stance, who lifts his right arm to hold his hat in place. The muscle in the upraised arm is bulging, suggests that there is latent masculinity in that thin frame. So for example, in a Kushan Buddha, that latent masculinity is shown in the slightly erect penis that's visible under the Sangati of the Buddha. Here it's shown in the arm. It's very interesting, right? In that thin frame. If the stance of the sculpture is modernist, abstract, and thus enigmatic, the head is completely figurative, vernacular, and legible as the portrait of a bespectacled politician wearing a Gandhi topi or hat. To further complicate the visual codes, Shankar the cartoonist has placed the figure on a pedestal that looks like an unfinished rock. Is this just emerging, or has it decided to alight here? Nehru stands in all his sartorial elegance in front of this strange hybrid sculpture and proudly proclaims, I bought it. In front of him stand Maulana Abdul Kalam Azad and a host of well-known politicians of the day of various communities, including Rajendra Prasad and Lal Bahadur Shastri, looking at the sculpture in diverse attitudes. There is the dwarfish fellow in front standing obsequiously and gazing up at the sculpture. The slightly taller figure in black wearing a shorter version of the Nehru jacket appears to turn away in annoyance, but also is unable to resist a glance at the statue. Azad, Nehru's Minister for Education and Culture, fingers his chin in bewilderment at this inexplicable acquisition. Through its sharply calibrated presentation of various engagements with modern art, the cartoon also raises the question of whose taste the state's coffers fund. Whether good old-fashioned narcissism is behind the elite's enthusiastic identification with visual modernism, much like Chola King Rajaraja's identification with Shiva, right? Visual modernism, and whether the hybrid character of Indian modern art can really represent and become comprehensible to many, even those at the top. Another sculpture, and this is Ram Kinkar Bej. Bej is his community name. He never used it really when he signed, so I'll go with Ram Kinkar. Another sculpture further complicates the issues that I wish to raise today. In the 1950s, Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, was quite committed, as the cartoon above lampoons, to the state patronage of the arts. As the Reserve Bank of India website notes, Jawaharlal Nehru suggested that public buildings, many of which were imposing structures, could be utilized to, quote, encourage Indian artists to function in some way, unquote, and sculptors, painters, designers, etc. could be asked to cooperate. Nehru opined that the artwork, quote, should cost very little in comparison with the total cost of the buildings, but it will encourage Indian artists and would be greatly welcomed, I think, by the public. This is in 1950s when this was said. One of the new structures to be built was the Reserve Bank of India office in New Delhi, and that's what you see, these two statues are in front of it. A committee was formed which decided that 2 sculptures should adorn each side of the entrance of the building, and then it consulted industrialist and art patron J.R.D. Tata and the lawyer, art collector and connoisseur Karl Kandalwala, both Bombay people. The latter suggested that the theme of the commission should be a yaksha and a yakshini, or a yakshi, kind nature spirits entrusted with the care of natural treasures buried in the earth, especially around trees. That's how the Buddhists understand them, that's how the Jains understand them. Out of the 9 artists who were requested to submit proposals, only Ram Kinkar submitted sketches and models. By this time, Kinkar was an established artist, renowned for his experimental use of materials, themes, and compositions, such as the 1938 Santal family sculpted in concrete. For this project, let me just see if so these are his models that he's put, some of his models, right? That he did. Santal family sculpted in concrete. For this project, he took a sculpture of Manibhadra, who's also known as the Parkham Yaksha, housed in the Mathura Museum, a really glorious Yaksha, Mathura Museum. And in, just see if this is Santal family that Ram Kinkar is very famous for, and this is Milkal. Let me just show you this, okay? Housed in the Mathura Museum, and the Bees Nagar or Didarganj Yakshi, very famous Yakshi whose nose got broken when it went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art during the Festival of India, which dates from the 2nd century BCE or 3rd century BCE, housed respectively in the Indian Museum in Kolkata and the Patna Museum as his models, and developed 2 figures that are remarkable for the ambivalent monumentality he endowed upon them. They're gigantic yet reluctant stone idols. Yaksha represents prosperity through industry, while Yakshini, that's why he has that gear in his hand. You can see that gear? I'm sorry I don't have better pictures for this particular image. Represents prosperity through industry, while Yakshini represents prosperity through agriculture. He appears quite surly, with a gear in one hand and a money bag in the other. She looks impassive and not particularly interested in guarding or sharing the prosperity for which she is the custodian. Just get some water. Today, Kinkar's Yaksha and Yakshi have acquired a canonical status in Indian art. As one of the first major sculptures after independence to qualify as monumental public art, it can be tempting to see the pair as uncontested and fully established from the moment of installation. Like they were installed and they were completely accepted. Wow, we have this great public monumental art now that connects us to our tradition. But the classicism and appropriation and orientation toward an ancient culture and its productions has always had a complex history in modern India. There is the desire to monumentalize the past, i.e. assume it has to have lasting significance for the present and the future, as well as a deep fear of its disruptive power and a disregard for its seeming irrelevance. This complex mix of veneration and historical distance, there's a saying, it comes from a novel, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. That's how a lot of people view the past from the present, right? Dogged the entire Yaksha-Yakshi project. The Yaksha appeared to mock independent India's private capital, while the Yakshi challenged its sense of propriety. Her pudendum is visible, so it was shocking to people. The RBI website informs us, and bravo to the RBI for being open about the complexity of this image. When the statues were finally installed, it was over 10 years since they had been commissioned. India had really changed. In the meanwhile, the times and circumstances and the outlook of the country and its leaders had changed. The statues, when being installed at the Reserve Bank's New Delhi office on Parliament Street, did seem to offend the prudish sensibilities of parts of the populace. The specific cause of the provocation was the statue of Yakshini depicted in her natural beauty. The issues of the statues was raised rather starkly in the Rajya Sabha by Professor Satyavrata Siddhantalankar. Will the Minister of Works and Housing and Supply be pleased to state, is it a fact that the statue of a naked woman has been erected in front of the Reserve Bank of India, Parliament Street? And if so, what is the object in erecting this statue of a naked woman? An exegesis that the naked woman was essentially an allegorical interpretation, this is the RBI website still, representing agriculture and wealth, was perhaps convincing, though not without further supplementary questions regarding costs incurred and the details of the committee who recommended the art. So you can see that the struggles have started. While the cause of disquiet generally was the Yakshini, the popular weekly tabloid Blitz certainly was not prudish in its outlook or ill-informed of art. Again, this is the RBI website. Characteristically put an entirely different angle on the statues and likened the Yaksha to resemble Sadoba Patil, an industrialist in Mumbai. Against the title Yaksha Patil, the Blitz depicted a photograph of the statue and commented, but artist Ramkinkar's conception of the modern Yaksha, which now guards the Reserve Bank, has coincidentally enough taken an amazing likeness to Sadoba Patil, one of the most zealous guardians of wealth and big business in the country. This aspect of the project has been more or less forgotten in more contemporary engagements with Kinkar's oeuvre. Instead, the RBI Yaksha and Yakshi have been widely discussed in recent retrospectives of Kinkar's work. Raqs Media Collective has also created an installation work by placing these figures on the edge of the Yamuna in Delhi, symbolically returning the pair to the riverine environment with which they have been associated historically, to guard the liquid gold water that courses through. Their work is a pun on currency and current, and intended to illuminate the flows of capital. It questions the appropriation of ancient spirits by an artist in the service of the newly founded nation state. In an essay that they titled Yaksha Prashna, the Yaksha's questions. Do you know the Yaksha Prashna? Where else it is? In the Mahabharata? Yeah. So they've taken that and they've like played with it. Raqs records an imaginary dialogue between themselves and the Yaksha and Yakshi. Yaksha, why do banknotes carry portraits? Raqs. So it's the Yaksha's questions and Raqs is giving the answers. Raqs, because the promise to pay the bearer can have no meaning if it is not backed by the picture of the head of a king, a dowager, a dictator, a dead prophet, or at the very least, a magnificent wild beast. Because a banknote without a picture is like a security guard without a uniform. Yakshi. In that case, why did Ramkinkar Bej sculpt me naked? Because he knew the answer to the previous question. And because, though everyone knows that the emperor has no clothes, it is well known that his treasury is actually empty, and that its guards keep their vigil, naked and alone. In the coda of the Yaksha Prashna, the riverbank episode, that's the title Raqs has given it, they write that Ramkinkar Bej's Yaksha and Yakshi figures stand guard outside the gates of the Reserve Bank, India's central bank on Parliament Street in New Delhi. Their monumental presence is the secret of their invisibility in the discourse around Ramkinkar Bej and his so-called subaltern modernity. What they mean by this is that Ramkinkar Bej has been seen as a subaltern modernist because he doesn't come from a Brahmanical or academic art school background. He learned on his own. He comes from a lower caste Bengali community. They can neither be resolved into the celebration, this is Raqs continuing, they can neither be resolved into a celebration of the mythic category of the people. This is, the people are not being celebrated by the Yaksha and Yakshi figures as the way that Ramkinkar has done them, nor be seen as a homage to the state. We could speculate that the Yakshi's impassive, blank stare and the Yaksha's barely disguised contempt, he looks kind of surly, for what he sees embody Ram Kinkar's Bej's own Yaksha Prashna to the Indian Republic. And as of now, we do not know of any answers that have a satisfactory purchase on Ram Kinkar's sculpted question marks. So they essentially see these as enigmas, enigmatic, public enigmas, artistic enigmas, visual enigmas. They're sophisticated, the Rux Media collective's sophisticated poetics rightly emphasize the strange visages and the indeterminate meanings embedded in the seemingly impassive monumental figures. Some critics rightly see their appropriation of historic discourses and objects and their anti-historical handling of them as a disinterest in art history. That Rux Media doesn't have any interest in art history, not even Ram Kinkar's art history, they just want to free objects from history and allow them to occupy the contemporary. This is a quote from the art historian Vidya Shivdas. But the form of such disinterest in history or art history and the mode of appropriation is premised on the fact that Rux takes for granted the classicism of these sculptures. That Kinkar and the sculptures he made are fully comfortable in their appropriation and orientation towards their ancient exemplars. In this, Rux viewing is surprisingly similar, though politically in opposition to less avant-garde discourses on golden ages and national heritages, which celebrate art as something born of history, but which transcends attempts at historicization in order to become classical. Because there is no deep endeavor to look at these sculptures as historical objects with specific producers, materials, circumstances, and temporalities, Rux accepts and furthers the classicist discourse of modern art. Also implicit in their writing is a critique of a modern artist such as Ram Kinkar, who comes from a lower caste background, a point emphasized by most writers, but who also is thought of as a pioneering genius. Rux instead wants to see the artist and his creation inhabiting that space between the not quite subaltern and the almost avant-garde, that in-between space, because it allows their own contemporary art project to gain more critical traction. In this sense, Rux, like many others, accepts the categories of the classical and the monumental and reauthorizes them even as they criticize the commissioning institution and perhaps even the modern artists who provide them with classicizing art. The classicizing modern must remain intact in order for many recent critiques of it to gain purchase. If the classicizing modern is troubled and disaggregated, then the critiques against it would have to involve themselves in rethinking of how we know and narrate our modernity. If one enters the archive of materials surrounding the making of the sculptures, a more detailed, complex, even if incomplete narrative emerges that helps us to think about the classicism of these sculptures in a different way. We gain insight into what the modern artist has to contend with when he or she took an art historical form that has been accorded classical status, especially when the project is a commission for an institution that seeks to represent its durability by using ancient themes. Recounting some incidents about the inspiration and process behind the creation of the final Yaksha and Yakshi will explicate the point I'm making. The first incident comes from A. Ramachandran's memoir of his teacher, Ram Kinkar. He notes that Kinkar's maquettes and models, such as this one, of the Yaksha and Yakshini are at great variance when compared to the monumental figures outside the RBI. They're smaller and made of concrete. Some are sweet-faced, some adhere more closely to their art historical exemplars or derive some of their energy from the Santal women Kinkar knew from the milieu of Shantiniketan, while another more fully refers to modern classics such as the British sculptor Jacob Epstein's 1931 Genesis. Ram Kinkar knew about this sculpture. The artist A. Ramachandran, who knew Kinkar closely at Shantiniketan, has this to say about Kinkar's process for composing these sculptures between the time he received the commission in 1956 and before it was installed in 1966. Kinkar worked, Ramachandran writes, like an accomplished musician, singing variations on the same raga. Kinkar tried many alternatives of these two images. Initially, they were close to those of the Mathura Yaksha and the Didarganj Yakshi, but the more he worked and reworked, they started assuming independent characteristics through his modern sensibilities, blending with his understanding of the classical tradition. The Yakshi images have a startling similarity with the female figure of the Santal family. Well, okay. This motif, just so that you know what the Santal family is, I don't know how he sees that, but it's interesting that he sees this. This is the pregnant Yakshi that Ram Kinkar made based on Jacob Epstein's model, right? So the Yakshi image have a startling similarity with the female figure of the Santal family. This motif must have triggered him to inquire into his familiar world of Santals, who were icons of the earth. All the images of working women planting seedlings and reaping harvest must have gone to the making of Yakshi. One of the last variations was the pregnant woman holding her bulging underbelly, where he must have referred to Epstein's controversial work, Genesis, which is this one. The Yaksha image shows all the connotations of Kubera, the god of wealth, with a very stark look and crude expression of a moneylender, in contrast to the voluptuous, graceful fertility figure of the Yakshi. Ramchandran's readings of the maquettes indicates that Kinkar went through several exercises to develop his sculptures. In the early stages, the Yaksha and the Yakshi were not intended to have the impassive stare and the disguised contempt that Rak sees in the sculptures that stand outside the RBI. In the memoir, Ramchandran gives us more details about the process of translating the maquettes and carving the stone figures. Looking back, I realize how simple and naive he was to take up such a huge commission without realizing the enormities of responsibilities he was undertaking. Besides, he had no experience with working on granite stone. Why? What was Ram Kinkar's avant-gardism? In part, it was working with a vernacular material, concrete. That was him. Right? The greatest mistake was to take up the entire task of selecting, cutting, and transporting of stones from the quarry to Delhi, besides engraving the colossal final image. The first assistant he employed, an ex-student of Kala Bhavana, messed up the work, and Kinkarda landed in the greatest crisis of his life. The mental tension which arose from many unsolved problems and bureaucratic procedure was too much for a simple person like him to bear, and Kinkarda started drowning his sorrow with large quantities of country liquor. The consequence of not being able to complete the work so haunted him that one night I remember him breaking down and saying he might have to land up in a jail. Here I give some credit to Pranab Dev Burman, another ex-student who with his organizational experience managed to get the stones transported, and with the help of traditional stone carvers from South India, who are used to making what? Temple sculpture. From South India, he had the project completed. But the discrepancy in quality between the original maquettes and the end product remained a tragedy forever. Hereinafter, Kinkarda became a broken man and an alcoholic. This is Ramachandran's version. For Kinkar, historical Buddhist sculpture became important because of the way the commission was framed. J.R.D. Tata and Karl Khandalwala said that Yaksha and Yakshi had to be the model for this sculpture. The committee which monitored the commissioning process, especially the art critic Karl Khandalwala, saw in the RBI building an opportunity to stage an indigenous classicism, much in the way English banks had staged the Greco-Roman past to express their stability and power. Here it is useful to recount Athena Leuci's summarization of the scholarship on national revivalism. I really like what she has to say. Triggered by a sudden socio-cultural change or political trauma, in our case partition and independence, revivals of past golden ages reveal to the community its authentic, usually pre-industrial and rural self, stimulate a regeneration of the community by bidding it to realize this perfect self under modern conditions. One aspect of post-independence modernism was a widespread effort to integrate the pre-modern, what was often framed as the classical, into period contemporary context. Marg is the perfect example. An example already discussed, of course, is the Pandyan Vishnu at TIFR. More fully, pre-modern art, particularly sculpture, because it embodied and engendered spatial and potentially collective experience, was repeatedly used to mediate modernity and Indian-ness during the creation of a decolonizing secular nation state. Indeed, the anxieties produced by cultural elites' interest in modern art that Shankar so humorously and succinctly captures in his cartoon is precisely mirrored in the choice of a yaksha and a yakshi as the symbolic face of the RBI. By the time the yaksha and the yakshi theme arrives in Kinker's workshop, it undergoes a transformation. The Shantiniketan sculptor is not content with allowing his vision of the pair to be inspired solely by the pre-modern past. He turns to other sources, as Ramachandran indicates in his memoir, like Epstein's sculpture in Britain. Epstein himself was looking at, it was at this time that all those books like Kumaraswamy's book on Hindu and Buddhist sculpture, all these things were being published, and Epstein was buying those books and using them to inspire his own sculpture. So it's a really interesting circle of shared ideas taken in different directions. Also, non-bourgeois women, such as the Santals, had already entered his work in the path-breaking Santal family and milk hall. In this project, a subaltern woman contributed to helping Kinker develop his modernist classicism, especially with regard to the conception of the female body. The photographer Devi Prasad, whose photographs Naman Ahuja has published in a very wonderful catalog, recounts that what the sculptor said in 1990 when discussing how during a critical period an incident gave him a sense of transcendental power that made its presence felt within him. In Kala Bhavan, it was not possible, this is Ram Kinker's words, translated into English by Devi Prasad, right? In Kala Bhavan, it is not possible to study the nude. None of you can imagine how essential it was for me to study the nude in the context of making the sculptures of Yaksha and Yakshi. During that period, I'd gone one evening to Malancha, Meera Devi's house, and for some personal reason, I saw that Radha Rani, their maidservant, was in the kitchen engaged in cooking. Our eyes met, and I showed her the way to my house in Sripalli. I asked her to come there at night, and that was that. Even after we had become intimate acquaintances, she was not prepared to undress herself completely. I tried to make her understand my problem. I told her about my assignment to make the sculpture of Yakshi. Radharani was a worshipper of God. Taking the Yakshi to be a goddess, she accepted the argument in connection with Yakshi. She never again refused to be studied in the nude whenever I asked her to do so in the context of art. In that way, she helped me tremendously in my vocation. In recent literature, much has been said about Ram Kinker's own subaltern status or his minority positioning within major visual languages. Nobody else was really using concrete the way he was using, or the mixing up cubism and expressionism and all this kind of experimentation that he was doing, such as the Bengal school, cubism, primitivism, etc. This reading of his work crystallizes and becomes meaningful, particularly in a discussion of his pre-1947 works, such as Santal Family and Milk Hall. For example, the art historian Santosh S. writes while discussing these sculptures, that a, quote, detailed analysis of Ramkinkar's deployment of language would explore the way in which he deterritorializes the major languages, i.e. Bengal school, Cubism. They're not no longer associated just with Bengal or with Paris or any place else. In order to destabilize the grand narrative of nationalism and its primitivist discourses. In the history of Bengal school, Ram Kinkar possesses a unique position. He's one among the foremost figures who've moved away from the diktats of the Oriental aestheticism or the pastoral naturalism of Bengal school. It is not to claim that he has completely rejected the contribution of Bengal school, but unlike almost all of the practitioners of his time, he had deeply engaged with the modernist language of Europe, the Cubist and Expressionist languages that had motivated his persuasion for a distinct language which facilitates a minoritarian positioning. Early works of Ramkinkar show his mastery over the Orientalist pictorial traditions. His works have an aspect of spontaneity, like the case of Expressionists, as well as they are structural at the same time, like the Cubists. His sculptures, for instance, are structurally constructional and stable as balanced by axis lines, either centralized or distributed, but through the peculiar mixture of techniques like molding and chiseling, the compound of conflicting representational strategies like figuration and abstraction, and the special emphasis on the tactility of the surfaces they overcome, the rigidity of all structures. So they're not pure cubists, they're not purely figurative, they're not purely abstract. All these different techniques, materials make them transcend all that, right? They're objective and subjective at the same time. End of Santosh's thing. In 1947, after 1947, the question of Kinkar's minoritarian positioning becomes complicated in the context of his own frame, his desire to attempt a large project and the agendas of the newly formed nation. Like any ambitious artist, he sought to expand the scale of his work. So he wasn't the same Shanti Niketan, milk hall making, Chantal family Kinkar. He was a post-independence sculptor seeking a major commission on a national scale. We have to permit artists, like every other person, to grow and change and rethink their own work and keep resituating themselves in new contexts. Like any ambitious artist, he sought to expand the scale of his work, to wrestle with new languages and themes, and in this instance, a historical one, work with new patrons and find new contexts for situating his ideas. And this is where I have a big argument in some ways with Rux, because they don't give him, in a sense, that permission. It's not that they need to give permission. He's doing it, just see it. Just acknowledge it, right? For situating his ideas. The modernisms that he experimented with and successfully mastered in the context of Shantiniketan had to be recalibrated, even discarded to fulfill the RBI commission. His minoritarian positioning becomes allied to the project of creating a visual culture for the new Indian nation, even as he becomes alienated from the production of the final sculptures. And yet, his modernism itself is made richer and more complex, and as Santosh S. says, ought to be seen as a language in the process of becoming, not being, not done, but it's in the process of becoming. And not, as Rux would have us see it, as an already consolidated classical. To create Yaksha and Yakshi, Kinkar had to work with his own legacy of experimentation, ancient Indic art, a pre-World War II British modernist sculpture by an artist who was deeply engaged with early Buddhist art, primitivism, cubism, the living art of stone sculpture, Santal woman, the female body of a domestic worker, who was also his lover, and the intersection of her religiosity with the self-sacralization of his artistic desire. The sculpture, whether the sculptor intended or not, became an important opportunity for imagining and instantiating an Indian modernist classicism, not as something already resolved, but as a possibility bristling with all sorts of tensions. More often than not, writers evaluate the large sculptures as failures and the maquettes as successes. But perhaps if we view the RBI Yaksha and Yakshini not as a final product, but as another stage in Ram Kinkar's experimentation, we can perhaps understand that being a modernist in post-1947 India was not an easy task. No one had single-handedly worked with a classical material such as stone on this scale in the history of modern India, during the Raj or after independence. Asking South Indian sculptors habituated to making granite idols to work with Himalayan stone and carve images that are at once Shilpa-shastric and Cubist, based on models made in another material, appears in hindsight as more of a nation-building exercise than a sure way to create an aesthetically efficacious images. Ultimately, these sculptures pose a challenging question to anyone who interprets Kinkar's oeuvre teleologically as a series of significant works or processes that lead up to his eventual absorption into the nation's sense of its own modernity. The mixed reception of the sculptures received when they were finally installed, and the profound ambivalence that Kinkar himself felt toward them place a burden on the art historian or critic, and even the contemporary artist, to keep rereading the oeuvre. I think I'll stop here. I could go on and show you a lot more images, but I want to have time for questions. I'll stop here. Thank you very much for listening. Kind of a complex argument. It's kind of a weird paper. I don't think, I myself had to work really hard to see things this way. Everything's so discreetly packaged now. That's a science institution, this is modern art, this is Ram Kinkar, that's Shantiniketan, this is RBI. But they're all happening at the same time. And the same people are involved. Yeah.
Can you give us any insight into conversations? Yeah. Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. Just in terms of this commission,
Yeah.
Is there any insight you can give us in terms of conversations which may have happened between the artist and the commissioning bodies and Annapurna Garimella during the process of the work's creation? I'm just interested in that
Okay. Okay, so I think there's nothing published. So this is a very preliminary paper. So the next stage would be to go into the National Archives and look at the records of that period to understand how the committee looked at the maquettes. Clearly, there was some agreement that he was going the right direction because he got the commission, right? What's weird is kind of sidestepping your question, but answering it in a way. What we know circulates in public are his students' narratives about him and this work. And all those students are now quite famous, like Ramchandran and one. And what's interesting is all of them see what they want to see in these sculptures. He was already an alcoholic, but it makes it more interesting to construct alcoholism as tied to this transition from being a Shantiniketan-based modernist to a nation-state modernist, you know? And another guy, student of his, Krishna, he also has a book, I just lost his name, I'm sorry, also does the same thing. So what I find is that from because we don't have good archival materials available for research, and so much of our knowledge is based on personal relationships, which are not to be negated. But because they're based also on consolidating the person speaking's relationship to that past, it's very hard to understand what was happening at that time. So I could get like bits and pieces together to write this essay. But I think the next stage of the project would actually take it further into that kind of question. Yes. I did a lot of research in Rupkala, and which is Lalit Kala Contemporary, and all these reading at this time. So that part is not here in this essay, and I'll probably write it up over the next couple of years or so. I think I read about 30 years worth of Lalit Kala magazines to understand how sculpture awards were given, what were the categories, and in the early years, there was a category called traditional. And Lalit Kala was supposed to be for all kinds of art when it was set up under Maulana Abdul Kalam Azad's Ministry of Culture, but very quickly it became only for contemporary, period contemporary art. The only way they addressed non-contemporary or pre-modern art was to make these publications like of Gita Govinda, or these very nice reproductions of paintings on handmade paper. So that was the way that they did it. But otherwise, there was a category in the sculpture awards, modern sculpture awards, contemporary sculpture awards, for traditional, for modern, all these sort of things. And so I think that similar notions must have been operating in the committee's evaluation of these. It was such a widely circulating. One of the most interesting critiques of this is Richard Bartholomew's critique. And it's there in Pablo Bartholomew's book that he's published on his father about this. It's very interesting. He's very much against, he's very resistant to this kind of thing. He's not against pre-modern art, he's against this kind of thing that was happening. And this is the argument, of course, he and Swaminathan also had to some extent with each other. Yes?
You started off with Chandika,
Yeah.
Russia, Mulk Rajavan, and all the rest. My understanding of the development of Chandika was that originally there was Matthew Nowitzki's.
That's right.
And his proposal that was to be executed.
That's right.
You've done research in art publication and all the rest of it. So how does this shift from a sort of a romantic, subjective sort of a city plan of Nowitzki, how does it change to Corbusier? There are off-the-cuff critics who have said that really Nehru had nothing to do with it. It was just, he was sort of pushed into, or just proposed. And did really Kandalawala or whatever, Tata and Mulk Rajavan really had a role to play in the final building of Chandika?
No, not Tata. Not Tata. That's but Marg. Okay. So Matthew Nowitzki died in a plane crash. So that meant that was the end of it. And Minette de Silva, I should show you since I have this. I feel very proud of her, so I feel like I have to show this fabulous woman. Let me just close this. Let me show you this fabulous woman. This is Minette de Silva, and she was a Sinhalese architect who was trained in Britain. She was very good friends with Corbusier. She was also the sister of Anil de Silva, who was living in Bombay at the time. Minette was also living in Bombay at the time. She's also one of the founders of MARG in 1946, 1 year before independence. And she was involved with Otto Königsberger, the German architect's office. She was employed there. She did a lot of buildings in Bangalore. She was a very interesting woman. She's been completely written out of the Chandigarh story. And there's a young Sinhalese British architect in London who is trying to trace her history and involvement. It's most likely that it was she who introduced Mulk Raj Anand to Corbusier, because she had a correspondence with Corbusier. They were friends, epistolary friendship. And then it was probably through her that the whole thing happened. Now, when you look at Corbusier and his approach, he had a plan. I mean, his plan for a city designed around a car was already now about 20 years old. And he wanted a place to put it. And he kind of put it in Chandigarh, and that's basically it. And it worked in some sense because it's a very geomantic kind of notion that the government offices of Chandigarh are at the head, and these things are in the arms, and this thing are the chest, and then there's the thighs. It's kind of like a Vastu Purusha Mandala type thing, right? I mean, it's very similar in some sense. So I have a feeling from the research that I've done that Nehru didn't need to be involved at every step in all of this. He actually had lots of really smart friends like Mulk and other people. And I don't know how much Mulk was involved in the design part, but he certainly was, his personality was to cheerlead what he thought were important things. And people respected him. His capacity, it's almost a kind of, he was also, as you know, the first person to showcase the Navi Mumbai plan in the pages of MARG. So it's not that he necessarily had to be hovering over the shoulders of everybody, like saying this is the right thing to do, this is not the right thing to do, but he actually did, or gave it that space, that national stage, international stage for it to gain validity. You also have to remember that after World War II, India had a kind of moral authority that no other country has had, except for maybe Václav Havel's Czech Republic, right? Because of Gandhi and the way that India gained its independence. And so people were really enthusiastically interested in coming here and trying it out. It's not a coincidence that Chandigarh and Auroville all happened within like 15 years of each other, right? Auroville is also another utopian project. Chandigarh is also a utopian project. And it's also no coincidence that it's always the decolonizing countries that are commissioning European and American artists, architects to build full-scale cities, because they are seeking a modern identity. Look at Islamabad, look at Dhaka, look at Chandigarh, look at Canberra, look at Pretoria, all these places, right? So it is in these countries that modernism from Europe and America fully gets to exercise its authority. And that's an interesting thing. There's an argument that Mary McLeod, I think, has made, a very interesting argument in The Sex of Architecture, I think. A very interesting book by MIT, published about now maybe 15, 20 years ago, where she discusses the fact that modern architectures and modern architects are first given massive patronage by women in Europe and America. And it's because it is part of constructing themselves as modern women who have their authority over their own money. They can want a new aesthetics for that modernity. Peggy Guggenheim, Gertrude Stein, all these people are deeply influential. And the case study she uses is Gert Rietveld, that very famous Dutch architect. He built this house for this woman who became his lover. She was involved in the feminist suffragette movement in Holland, also promoter of birth control. So repeatedly, the two major patrons for modernism as a group are countries which are seeking to construct themselves after the experience of colonization, and also women.
Alto had his Maria Gulitzer, but who did Corbusier have as his female driving force?
Well, many of his villas were.
Yes, of course, but yes.
Yes.
Frank Lloyd Wright,
Of course, many of them. So it's very interesting. That part of that history is not really thought through.
But isn't it a little simplistic to connect it with the rise of feminist?
Well, when you read the archival material, it's very clear that for them, they were giving patronage to modern architects as part of their feminism, their modernity. Whether the architects necessarily saw it the same way, I'm not seeing that. Did Corbusier see India as a fully modern nation? He's deeply conflicted about it. He wants to make it modern. Yeah.
There's no concrete record of meetings, dialogues, whatever, between the architect and the government about...
Again, this is all has to be worked out by visiting the National Archives. They're just being, properly... There should be a lot of material. I mean, there's vast amounts of research. I don't know, am I like one of the few people that works on this kind of stuff? Am I one of the few people that works on this kind of stuff? Yeah, there are very few people who work on this stuff. I mean, I can do this to the extent I can do it given my other responsibilities.
I think one of because this is becoming very architectural conversation, very little architectural research has ever bothered on sort of conversational archives or governmental archives.
Yeah.
Normally the architectural research remains so much around the material object that the background conversational material never sort of
comes into it.
Not at least the ones that I know in India.
No.
That sense.
And if you look at, for example, the Madan Mahatta show that Ram Rahman curated, the architectural photographer Madan Mahatta, whose studios are still there in Connaught Place in Delhi, that may be like one of the first times you actually get insight into a vast amount of material of architects that architects commissioned to be made about their buildings.
In fact, I was a bit lost when you were talking on Yugoshi's essay, The Yogi and the Acrobat.
Yes.
Now, any of those essays never sort of throw light on any of these kind of conversations. They get too lost for whatever reasons. That essay is also valid for many ideas, but they get lost in those kind of conversations rather than anytime giving us a sense. But actually, Mahendra Raj's one interview talks about, like, for example, the technology struggle at that level of, how engineers were working on this project and where Corbusier was losing his hands on what the shape of building was taking up. So I found that was much more real in the sense of what was happening on site. You get a certain sense of that. But from a P.V. Doshi essay, you never get a sense of the working thinking of the architect. You get this whole sort of storm of ideas on Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright. So I think it's also the mentality of research in different spheres and field. And if you the kind of work you do, or also sometimes the papers that Nancy writes. I think there are very few people who sort of go into the non-seen niches and conversations which are not part of art history to then look at what we would otherwise see as art historical material. Because she recently presented a version of a conversation on Mulk and the Chainale in India, and that has a lot to do with conversations that are in parallel spaces, but then you sort of lead them back into the art historical object. But that practice is very
yeah, I think there's very few people who are interested in looking in using historical materials for critical thinking. I think most architects who write in India write as sages.
Yeah.
They want to be seen as seekers. They're on a path. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, if that's what you want to do, that's what you want to do. All I'm saying is that it's the responsibility of many other people, if they're interested in going and doing the research in the National Archives, in the PWD department, in photo studios, in architecture schools.
You also talked about Devi Prasad. Have you done research on this one?
No, it's a
There's
number.
a whole cache of photographers.
Oh, yes. Totally. I've seen those photographs.
What has happened to them?
I think they're...
Somebody, one of his relatives, holding on to them.
yeah, it's somewhere in England, I think.
Sorry?
I think it's somewhere in England, if I'm not mistaken.
And he was also an accomplished potter.
Yes, he was. In
And
England.
was connected with Bertrand Russell.
Absolutely.
and
He had a whole rich life.
Yes,
Yep.
very interesting.
Yeah, it's in Naman's book, but I think the actual photographs are in England, if I'm not mistaken. With his son, yeah. There's another, that wonderful photographer whose book Oxford has just published. अरे यार कौन है वो Bengali who was with the American woman photographer when Ram Rahman did this wonderful talk about Sunil Jaina's work. These are all like all this needs to come together, you know, like the design of buildings, the patron's intentions, the discussions for funding, the government involvement, the mandates that were being put forward by just now I read one interesting paper by the theater historian Anita Cherian, who's looked at the first dance conference that happened in, I think in 1956 in the Sangeet Natak Academy. It's fascinating to see. Mulk Raj Anand was also involved on the committee. He was on the committee there. It's fascinating to understand they literally are saying this is classical, this is not classical, this is classical, this is not classical. And what are the conditions? Well, over-eroticism is one thing that would make it not classical. So for example, Parsi theater can't be classical, right? So it's all these very interesting discussions are happening. So what I've done is like maybe, like a 0.5 millimeter of work on the mountain of material that needs to be touched. And that I'm doing this very specifically because I'm interested in sculpture. And I was forced to write this essay, literally, by somebody who wanted me to write an entire history of sculpture from 1947 to now. And I said, well, you can fund me for the next 10 years and I'll be happy to do that. But I wrote this. Thank you for being so patient and interested. Thank you.